Hey y'all, I'm Karen Mayer Cunningham, the special education boss. If you've ever felt confused, overwhelmed, or just plain frustrated at the 504 IEP table, you are in the right place. Every week, I'm breaking down the rules, the rights, and the realities of special education so you can walk into meetings informed, empowered, and ready to make real change. And whether you're a parent, a teacher, an advocate, a school-based member, or somebody who's just trying to do right by a student, this podcast gives you straight talk, real answers, and tools that you can use immediately. I'm not here to play politics. I'm not here to play sides. I'm here to train people who sit at the table and teach you how to follow the law, ask the right questions, and protect the rights of students. So go ahead and hit subscribe, share this with a friend, and you know what? Meet me back here every single week. We're not just talking about change. We're making it. Because when you know better, you do better. And when we get it right for the child, we get it right for everybody. Hey, you guys, welcome. We are so glad to have you, and we're super excited to have, without a doubt, our favorite guest on, Dr. Mitchell Yell. He is an author, a special education advocate, and a special education hearing officer in South Carolina. And he brings us lots of solid wisdom every time he comes on and answers our burning questions. So, Mitch, thank you for coming on. We always appreciate it.
Thank you for asking. Glad to be
Yes.
here.
Yes. So, kind of, it's near the end of the year. I always say that there's March Madness, April Fools, and then mayhem. These last 3 months of the year, everything kind of like piles up. I think, our talk tonight is on two different things, which they sort of go, for me, they go hand in hand, but especially design instruction, and then, documentation and progress measuring and monitoring. So, this week, and I always say this week, but I do about 500 IEP meetings a year. I really struggle to convey to IEP teams when I'm asking them about what is their specially designed instruction. And so often when I ask, and it's not a got you question, I always just say, tell me what that is when you're working with Billy on math, and, what is that magic sauce that you're doing? And often they will list to me. I remember yesterday I was talking to a resource teacher, and I said, what are the strategies that you use to teach Sally how to self-manage or learn a strategy for reading fluence? And he's like, we use UFly, and she gets extended time, and I let her retest. And so I think, part of that is because we're not very good at teaching teachers sort of this special ed language, right? They're just supposed to take a special ed test and they're just going to know. So can you give us like the legal definition of specially designed instruction and how we can sort of get that out of educators? We know they're doing it, but I'm trying to get that language out in the document.
Well, I always think actually the legal definition is pretty simple. It's just specially designed instruction means adapting either content methodology or delivery instruction as appropriate to the needs of the child, to address the unique needs of the child. So it really is it has to do with content, what they're going to teach, methodology, how they're going to teach, and then who's going to deliver the instruction, when is it going to be delivered, and where. That's that's what I believe SDI means from a legal standpoint.
Right. And so what would be some of those methodologies? Because often I hear this is, we use Star Renaissance, we use iReady, we use, all of these curriculums or software, right? But a curriculum isn't specially designed instruction. A computer program is not specially designed instruction.
Well, to use your example, you were saying about building fluency. I would say using a repeated reading exercise to build fluency, or using timed reading exercises. And what exactly does that mean? Now, a repeating reading exercise, for example, is just giving a child a passage on one day, counting the words correct, giving it the next day, same one, and counting how many words they have correct. And when they reach a certain number, you go to a different passage. That was a fluency building exercise developed in the 70s, repeated readings. And that's, to me, a type of methodology in SDI. Or, a systematic or explicit instruction in reading on phonics, for example, uh, that would be that would be a methodology of SDI.
Okay. And so, as a hearing officer, and I don't know, is the question of, in Texas, when we they list all the due process decisions, it will say LRE. It gives you the categories: LRE,
Yeah.
FAPE. What are sort of precautions that you would give school-based members that might come to something that you may need to make a decision on as a hearing officer as it relates to specially designed instruction?
Well, for school-based members, what I would say is understand that as from the viewpoint of a hearing officer, what I have to be most concerned with is the substantive. Is the IEP reasonably likely to enable a child to make progress, or does it actually enable the child to make progress? And you do that through collecting data, through progress monitoring data. Um, so I would say that's the important thing for school-based members. I would say from a due process standard uh, for advocates, don't get too hung up with procedures. Because
Right.
when it goes to a hearing, it's going to be about the substance. Though
Yeah.
there's only a few procedures that'll are like the hanging offense for school districts. And as you know, one of them is not involving the parents in a meaningful way. So
Right.
that's very important. Another is also failing to implement.
Right.
That's actually a procedural error, but it's a well, Perry Zurkel has called it the third dimension of FAPE. So yeah, the procedural dimension, the substantive dimension, the implementation. So I would say school-based, watch the substantive, make certain it's being implemented. The IEP, your accommodations, that's not a list of instructions or a list of suggestions. I
They're
should
not optional.
they're not optional. No, if it's in the IEP, you have to do it. So school-based, and this is really up to the LEA, I believe, local educational agency representative to make certain that IEP is being implemented as agreed upon.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you say that. So I have had and really because of your training, you're so smart. Up until I met you a couple years ago, I really was Office of Civil Rights, mediation, and then, heaven forbid that we could never work something out, then, partner with a firm to do due process. But I've really, thanks to your training and some other people, really tightened up and kind of mastered the state complaint. And so as it relates to my state and probably a lot of other states, um, it seems sort of in a level, I don't know another word other than arrogance. We have districts that literally are only putting paraprofessionals and that are delivering the in-class support, right? And so then of course I file under 300.323, failure to implement the IEP, right? And that number two, 300.156, or I've got it memorized for the Texas code, that there was not a certified special educator delivering that. And so, for me, my rub is I don't have any problems with a paraprofessional. I love paraprofessionals. They changed my son's life, they changed everybody's life, but they have to be under the direct supervision and watchful eye of a special educator. So this
Absolutely.
sort of little conversation has come up at meetings, is that Karen, we just disagree on what supervision is. So am I supervising you right now in another? So I am not looking for 100%. I'm not unaware of the shortage in special education, but this is just it seems to like have exploded the wrong direction since COVID. And I don't believe that all of it is about staffing. And so kind of, if you saw that, the failure to implement for me goes everywhere, right? If you didn't have the specially designed instruction, then I would say these IEP goals that you took data on, I would say that's fraudulent because no special educator took data on that. Do you see that in cases? Have you heard about that in cases? It just, for me, and my partners, has exploded in the families we serve.
Well, it's kind of in South Carolina, we have a kind of a different system than you do in Texas. We have a two-tier system. And so I don't really do the first tier. I do the reviews now as a second tier. So if a hearing officer's decision gets appealed, that's when I get it. And primarily, and we don't really have a lot of attorneys that are parent advocates. We have plenty that work with school districts.
Yeah.
And so we have so many parents will go pro se.
Okay.
They'll be their own representative. And that's usually not a good thing because they tend to focus on the procedural errors. And
Yeah.
that's not where it really is at. It's the substantive and
Yeah.
the
And can you
implementation.
just yeah, can you describe the procedural errors and the substantive errors? What's the difference? Because so many people get, I call it stuck on the little stuff. And while it
Yeah.
was a procedural error that you didn't sign that paper, that's not going to be the educational impact somebody's looking at.
Absolutely. That's a really good point, Karen. As a hearing officer, what I have to do is if a procedural error is brought up, first I have to determine did they really do that procedural error? And then did the procedural error result in substantive harm? And usually the answer is no, unless it's a failure to implement, which is
Right.
technically a procedural error, but that's a
Pretty
killer.
big. Yeah.
Yeah. So the procedures are what the idea, in Texas code, what they say you have to do. When you send out your prior written notice, who has to be in the IEP team meeting, what you have to have the IEP in the IEP. I mean, those are the procedures. I always tell people that if you suffer from insomnia, take the idea to bed with you one night and read it because it's just procedure after procedure, and it
Yeah.
just put you to sleep. The substance, on the other hand, is where the rubber really meets the road, because in 2004, Congress, of course, said you can't even decide that FAPE was a school district failed to enable a student to make progress or receive FAPE on procedural grounds alone, unless those procedural errors, I should say, result in the parent not being involved. Otherwise, it's all substantive. It's all,
Right.
were there goals? Did you measure the goals? Did you make changes? I just had a case in which they did not, they sit in the IEP, they would report 4 times, every semester or every quarter, they had broken into quarters, they would report on the child's progress. They monitored and they would report.
Right.
They didn't monitor, they didn't report. And when they did at the end of the year, they said, gee, the child hasn't made any progress this year. Hope we do better next year.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Doggone.
Yeah, I had an IEP progress report, which is what I start my meetings with. I think that's a huge thing that people miss because we build off of what we did last year,
Yeah.
and they are a mess. I had in my gentle German Irish way, I said, I find it hard to believe that on all 9 goals, he was at 70% for every goal, every like, is he a robot? And then
Yeah.
kind of the more you unpack that, I just don't believe, because I don't believe that there's malice in schools. We don't train, in my opinion, and I could be wrong. We're not training special education case managers. We're not training special education teachers. We give them that week back to school. We give them 500 documents, sign here, or I just think you accept the email, and they just go, I'm so glad you love kids, Mitch. You're gonna be great. And I
Yeah.
wish, I know you and I have talked about, I wish if there is a reenactment coming, that there is an obligation on the SEA to train these wonderful specialists called special educators in some sort of baseline 8-hour video, something, right?
Yeah.
But there never has been, has there?
No, well, there was, for a while, the law did require a comprehensive system of personnel development. And that was done away with many years ago. And there still is. Some states do a better job. But I agree with you, and I don't think teachers don't monitor progress because they don't want to. I
Yeah.
think it's because they don't know how to do so in a real efficient, user-friendly, quick
Yeah.
manner. Now, before we were talking, remember that odd thing came in? I thought it was you, and you thought something was going on in mine. Well, it was a Progress Center webinar. And,
Okay.
and what they were saying is someone was asking a question. Well, this progress monitoring takes 40 minutes. How can I possibly teach? Well, good progress monitoring takes 2 minutes or 1 minute. There's so many really good, valid, reliable ways to monitor progress. And teachers just sometimes aren't really taught how to do that.
And what are those ways for people that are or rural, or they are not in a big city, or their district's not going to, participate in Part D, which is a conversation
Yeah.
for another day.
Yeah.
But
I,
what
I,
what could a teacher in ABC school district start to do tomorrow? That's because when I say we get it right for the child, we get it right for everybody. It serves everybody. It's not a punitive thing for the teacher. It serves
oh,
the teacher and the student.
Absolutely. It serves the student because I mean, there's no doubt there's been research since the 80s that have shown when teachers do progress monitoring and they make changes based on that data, their kids achieve more. There's just no
Yeah,
doubt about it. And
yeah,
plus, of course, it's required by law. Um, but there are many things teachers can do. Intervention Central, Easy CBM are websites. There's one called the CBM Warehouse through Intervention Central. These are free websites
right.
that have really great information. Then actually the Department of Education has the Progress Center, the National Center on Intensive Intervention. You can get some great information. Of course, it's all free. They have
Yeah,
webinars, instructional modules, things like that.
yeah.
So
One of
it's
the
out there. It's just that people have to avail themselves of it. Because
right. And we'll put those links underneath the video we posted on YouTube so that y'all can have that. I One of the things I run across is I go over the last 36 instructional weeks IP progress for people that did actually monitor. And Billy was supposed to be at 75% in the annual IP. And at the end of the first grading period, he's at 80, and we don't do anything else. And really good-hearted teachers, because you can tell, because I asked them, I'll say, did you reach out to Mr. and Mrs. Smith to rewrite the goal since he met it? And no, we just reinforced it.
yeah.
So kind of speak to that.
Well, I think that's a problem that a lot of teachers have, and I think it's a misunderstanding that if your progress monitoring data shows that a child made progress, well, that's fine. You're done. But no, I would say, one of the things we know from curriculum-based measurement is the best teachers actually up their goals. If the
Right.
child has made it, they up their goals. And you've got to remember too, actually idea of the IEP, it doesn't guarantee success. It guarantees you're going to work toward those goals. The teacher's going to make the best efforts that they can. And I hear this too often too, and I'm sure you probably had, Karen. Well, we didn't want to go that high because if the child doesn't make it, we're in real trouble. Well, no, you're not. As long as you've done your job and you've measured and you've made instructional changes, you've done what you need to do.
Yeah.
It's not the ambitious goals that are not met that get school districts in trouble. It's the unambitious goals that if a child meets them, it doesn't mean anything.
Right. I had a IP recently, and the student went from 120 words correct per minute in a year to 124.
Oh
And
boy.
her proposal was for another 36 instructional weeks, 128. I'm
Mm,
sure I said something nice. I just, we look at rate of progress and expectancy, and I feel bad for these teachers because literally we're sort of lumbering through IP meetings. Two of the new proposed goals for this student were literally the same goal. Not kind of, not sort of. We didn't like literally. And I think part of the problem for school districts is most software now, whether it's Empower, Success Ed, eStar, they have a button that you push and it says, I need a fourth grade math goal. So they push that button. But
yeah.
then that's a state standard. Then we have to make it special education, right?
Yeah.
And so
Right.
I just wish schools provided those sorts of supports to their special educators and their parents, but they don't. So when you're talking about measuring and monitoring, this is the number one question that we get, the number one question that I'm told I'm wrong, I don't know anything, which may be true. We don't have to measure and monitor. We don't have to track goals. If we do, it's It's not in the law. So can you help me share with them gently where it is in the law that we have to take data on the IEP?
Well, all you have to do is read the section of the law or the regulations on the development of the IEP right below the measurable goals. And I don't quite, it's 300 point, and I can't remember what exactly is. I could look it up. But right under, you have to write measurable and goals. Right under that, you have to write how you're going to measure those goals. And you have to write how you're going to report progress to parents. So it is very important, not only for the child, but it's important for the teacher too. I have to tell you this, I was once at a hearing in which the attorneys for the school district, of course, they prepare the witnesses and they set up all they know what questions going to be asked. And the attorney for the school district said, well, uh, I want to know about, did you monitor one of the things the parents said is the progress was not being monitored. And the attorney for the school district, when he had the teacher up, said, did you monitor progress? And the teacher said, oh, yes, I use something called curriculum-based measurement. In fact, I have graphs here. And the attorney had set up, and so they actually showed her graphs online. They showed her the baseline, they showed the goal, they showed all the measures toward the goal. And when the child was not meeting the goal, there was a vertical line and the teacher changed instruction. That's what teachers need to do.
Yeah. And I think isn't it in your state that it's actually a state statute that, or regulation that the baseline has to exist in the goal?
Yeah. They used to, I'm sure it still is. It was a policy that the state said that goals have to include the baseline. So to use your example of reading fluency, I would hope it'd be more than four words. But let's say they said the little Karen will, and they would have to put a baseline from 120 to 150 words
Right.
read correct in 1 minute.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a great thing that they did
Yeah. I,
because
I I often find when I'm with the school district that they will have what I call a smattering of goals. And I'm crazy and I'll say, can you direct me? And I'm sure I missed it. I look at a million pieces of paper every day. Can you tell me where the baseline is for this in the PLAF? And they get, I don't know if they're offended, but they're irritated with me, which is something I do for people. And they're like, well, he needs to work on it. Well, there's 100, state standards and every course content for every grade. And so we don't do that. And so, I just say, if you're only going to work on one thing for Billy in math, what would it be? And then we got to put that in the present levels, right?
right.
So
Mhm.
because that identified a need, and then there's going to be a corresponding service. And I just, I want kids to make progress in light of their circumstances. And
Right.
it's not to beat up teachers at all. But this is about, these kids get this one shot, right? It's not, they can't, like you and I could go to college and take more classes. They're not going to get SDI, and they're not going to get their progress measured, monitored, and adjusted once they graduate, right?
Yeah.
This is the
That's
only time that
right.
they get this intervention. It's not like crystallized intelligence. And so we're going to put those websites. And so if you don't know about the Progress Center, which I look at all the time, it's amazing. Dr. Yell is one of their, what's the fancy word? Are you
Senior consultant.
senior consultant? Ooh, I like
Yeah.
that. He's an SC. So that is an amazing website. So many, I love the little fact sheets that they have because I'm very simple. And, we train everybody that sits at the 504 IEP table because maybe your school district didn't do that. But definitely make sure that you are on that. I'm sure that they have a mailing list, and all the websites that Dr. Yell talked about previously. So I think we're going to open up for questions because I know we
Can
have,
I just say a couple things real quickly, Karen?
yeah, yeah,
Oh, based on something you said earlier, you said about goals being repeated.
yes,
No, when the Andrew decision came out of the Supreme Court and they just remanded, they said, here's the new law. Now you make the ruling, went back to district court. He basically said that the goals were the same, unchanged from year to year for this child. And as a result, And it was more in behavior than it was academics.
Right.
But as a result, he declared that the school district did not offer FAPE. We had a case here in South Carolina that actually went all the way to the Supreme Court, Carter v. Florence, but it started here as a FAPE case, and the school district lost because of the goals being so unambitious. The judge said these goals rendered the IEP inadequate from inception
Yeah.
because they didn't mean anything. If the child had, as the judge said, if the child would have met the goals, she still would have been losing ground to her
Right.
peers.
Right. And that's so important. And one of the other things that we get a lot, which is very bizarre to me, I'm very simple and not credentialed, is I will have an eligibility. And I say, eligibility is, there's nothing magical about the eligibility other than it opens the door for services, right?
Yeah.
We'll have a
Mhm.
student who's found eligible for ADHD, have a couple of SLDs. So we have a reading goal, got a math goal, and I'll say, for Layla, we're going to need to write an IEP goal around, her eligibility of ADHD. We don't see it. I said, it's all in the present level. She gets up and walks around the room. Well, it's not that bad. And we don't have to. So I said, so here's what we say in, child find. We assess children who may be in need of, who have suspected disabilities, who may be in need of special education. So then do you want to DNQ her? Well, no, it can't be both. Can you speak to that?
Um, yeah, that's an interesting thing, and actually, kind of, it's very similar to a case that I had a few years ago in which uh, evidently the LEA had said, well, this child has a learning disability, so we're not gonna address behavior. That's not an issue. This child has a learning disability.
Yeah.
Well, clearly they had a need, and there was a real need in behaviorally.
Yeah.
And so the important thing in hearing officers, they don't care or give a rip much about the designation or the
Right.
disability. They want to make certain that the needs are
The
met.
need. Yeah. Yeah.
That's the important thing.
Yeah. And I'm like, I always say this. I go, this isn't my data. This is your dad. You literally said she gets up and walks around the room.
Yeah.
And they will say, well, she doesn't do it as much. Okay. Well, the question is, does she have a behavior that impedes her? So she's walking around the room because it's hard for her to read, right? But that reading goal doesn't address, you're going to need to attend, sustain, and complete the task. And so it just is odd to me, the things that we debate at IEP meetings. Like, it's in the paperwork. So, and then the other thing that we hear, not as much, but we still do hear it in the Great Missouri and the Great Florida. We just have one eligibility. And I haven't said it out loud at a meeting, Mitch, but I want to. I'm like, do you just ship off those other kids? And it's amazing that I think sometimes people get so tied to software, right? Well, Karen, if I do this and press this radial button, then this will. And I said, well, good news is there's no software in IDEA. We can write it on a cocktail napkin. And so we need to identify what they met criteria for and look at those characteristics of that, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
And also, Barbara Bateman, you probably
yes,
read,
I
she
have her
wrote
books. Yeah.
Better IEPs back in 2012 was the last edition. And one of the things she said one time, I don't know if she said it in that book or not, but I was at a presentation she did where someone asked about repeated goals, like you were talking about.
Yeah.
She said, well, if you do that, you might as well have a stamp made does not provide FAPE and just stamp your IEP that way. Now, a child might not make their goals and you're going to have new goals, but you're not going to have the same thing year after year. And that, of course, is what happened with Andrew
Yeah.
in the
Absolutely.
Andrew case.
Absolutely. I was with I had the blessing to be with an attorney in another state this week. And I'll be darned if she didn't slip out a little rowdy. I was like, and I still hear that just sort of like, and if you didn't know, you wouldn't know. I was like, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. So anyway, all right. The great Stephanie, do we have questions from our friends from all over?
Today we have several.
Okay. And then for you guys, you are welcome to put questions in the question area, and then Stephanie will read them out to us.
My son has a severe learning disability, and the school is telling me he doesn't have a learning disability and has something else. He is having difficulty retaining information. What should I do? I'd like to ask for them to pay for private school for my child. What do you think?
Did you want to go first, Karen, or?
Well, I so we have to figure out what the problem is, right? And so sometimes we do literally today, I got an initial evaluation that was 3 pages long. So we have to do robust testing, right? And so as you guys can see on my videos, there's 8 areas, and testing does one of two things. It identifies or eliminates, and we want both. And sometimes when I hear this or see these evaluations, we just have insufficient evaluations, right? We didn't probe hard enough to find out what's going on. But we need to address what his educational deficit is.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, as from a hearing officer standpoint, um, child find of course is so important, but so identification, and again, just like Karen and I were saying, it's really about what are the students' needs. And if a school reasonably suspects there's a problem in reading, for example, and doesn't do anything about it, that's when schools have problems with child find, with FAPE issues.
Yeah. And so part of her question is, which I get this a lot, well, then I'll just have them pay for private. And so while that sounds reasonable, right? It's not my experience that comes unless there's going to be a due process hearing. Would that be your
Uh,
experience?
yeah. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, very much so. That's not a good place to start, for certain. That's the ending. That's usually what comes after the hearing.
Yeah. And the school would have to, you would have to prove that the school doesn't have an ability to educate your student. And if it's a learning disability, they have the ability to address that with the right supports and services.
Yeah.
Where in the IEP should the SDI information be located?
Usually in the special ed services, related services, supplementary aids and services can be located in any of those areas. But SDI usually will mean because it means you're adapting instruction in some way, methods or the content or the delivery, that quite frequently will be in the special education services that you offer or that are in the IEP.
You mentioned Andrew F. and Raleigh. So this question, they want to know what happens if the student is making progress in the general education setting, but cannot pass the general education curriculum due to a specific learning disability, even if that resource within class supports. Is the LRE and general ed appropriate when they can't pass?
Well, if a child, what is appropriate for the child is, placement is a secondary issue. The primary issue is what is appropriate? How can you develop an educational program that allow the child to make educational benefit? So FAPE is the first part, and then once you determine what will be a FAPE, then you can determine where it will be offered. Too many, and I've noticed this quite frequently, is that schools will sometimes say, well, we have to include all our kids. Sometimes that isn't appropriate. The child be in a general ed setting, and a child will need a special education setting, a resource room or something. You have to do what's appropriate for the child.
We hear a lot. I've got to get him back to LRE, like he's in the wrong cabin on a boat. Like it's a consideration. It's not a location. And I think that there are kids that I have served. I have a little boy. I think he's in 7th grade now, and he's never been at school. He has been homebound I've had him since he was 3. He's greatly impacted by his disability. He's deaf blind. He has some genetic issues. And he's been homebound the whole time. So it's not even appropriate for him to be in school. So
Mhm.
this notion that I got to get him back to, general ed, 10 years before COVID, I couldn't get a child in general ed. And now I see this new sweeping, we're just going to put everybody back in general ed and just see how that works out. That's not a good plan.
No, and I do have to tell you this too. Doug Fuchs and Lynn Fuchs and a few others have written a special issue of Journal of Disability Policy Studies, and Doug's article was called, no, let's see if I can get the actual name of it here.
Yeah.
The Individuals with Disabilities Act, Education Act, the most important question of policy question in the last 50 years is what Doug calls what versus where. That you have to determine what a child needs before you can determine where they should receive those services. And sometimes it's just not going to be in a general ed classroom, is
Yeah.
what I was just saying.
Yeah.
Comes from a parent of a sixth grader. What do you do if a child with a specific learning disability in reading, math, written expression, has OHI for ADHD and executive functioning issues, is in a co-taught classroom for reading and math, but there is no co-taught teacher for science and social studies and no SDI being given in that area?
Well, too, I mean, there are accommodations, and the supplementary aids and services are really designed for the team to determine what does the child need in those other classes, what accommodations do they need, and certainly co-teaching, I think, is often not done correctly. And it winds up being the teacher who is the co-teacher's like an aide in the classroom, and they're not really offering instruction. And I don't believe that's appropriate. I don't think the child would be receiving. Now, if they are in science and social studies, that should be addressed in the supplementary aids and services in the accommodations section.
Yeah, and even though there's not usually co-taught for science or social studies or even a resource room, we can certainly still modify that in a general ed setting and, scaffold the learner expectation down to a level that they can still be successful.
It seems often the targeted mastery level is always the same for all goals, whether it be 75, 80, or 85. What is the best way or reasonable manner to determine the reasonable percent of growth for a specific IEP goal to meet the letter and spirit of the law?
Well, there really isn't a specific way to do it, although a number of court decisions have come down against the use of percentages because too often they're not used correctly. You'll see, well, Stacy will make friendships 80% of the time. What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. It could be measured. It's 80% of what? There was a decision out of New York a few years back where the school used percentages in all their IEPs, and they had no beginning point, no ending point. They had no curriculum, and the judge basically said, "Well, these percentages don't mean anything here," and he was right. They didn't.
I
But
had a
we often see them.
Yeah, I had an IEP goal the other day that said that the student would use, I don't know, strategies to help her read more fluently. I'm like, well, how will you know if she's doing that? Is she going to raise her hand and say, I'm not? I mean, I said, is she reading out loud? No. So you're just going to go knock on her. Are you using your strategies? And so that's kind of hard to overcome. It's not measurable, right? Like measurable is we're at 100 Elm and we're going to get to 100 Main, and this is how we're going to do it. But she will. I'm allergic to she will and he will, like as evidenced by her grades. Oh, no. And I don't believe, if your child's the valedictorian, they may not actually be the valedictorian. When I went to school 100 years ago in the 70s, if we got a grade, that was the grade we got. There was no, and that's a push from admin to teachers, right? Every kid that I serve now is on the AV honor roll. It just is amazing.
Yeah.
My School is not delivering my son's SDI minutes, but I am not sure how to provide concrete evidence that they aren't following his IEP. When I ask them for his work or communication showing what he is learning and doing, I am met with resistance and minimal work samples. What are your recommendations?
I think what you need to do is you really, of course, we talked about this before. Collaboration is much better way than just confrontation. But one of the things you might want to do is just ask. You know, I would like a some sort of record of the amount of time that the child is receiving whatever the repeated readings or whatever there is. And then if it is not being met, that amount of time listed in the IEP is not being met, that's an implementation problem. You know, even in Texas, well, I think Texas, the Fifth Circuit is about the only circuit um, that says if the child makes progress, implementation doesn't matter. All the other circuits say, oh yeah, it does. Even if the child makes progress, if you're not implementing, that could be a denial of FAPE. And if they're in, but they all, one of the things that all circuits have done is use the term materiality, that it has to be a material error in implementing the IEP. And that can be not delivering the services or not delivering the amount of services.
Right. Yeah. And one of the things that I ask when I'm in an IEP meeting is I ask their leading questions, but I'll say, you know, Mitch, when you're working with Billy on math every week for his IEP goal, tell me what that looks like. And sometimes that question gives you information. And I'm all about let's fix it and move forward. Even if somebody said, I don't do that, if they were willing to going forward correct that, then I'm good, right? It's when they land on they didn't do it, they're not going to do it. So you know, I would say, you know, how can I support my son and help you? And when you work with him weekly, what does that look like? Do you pull him to the back of the room? Do you just walk over and give him a thumbs up? What does that look like so you can make sure that he's making gains? And then let them describe to you what that looks like. But this answer of everything we do is hands-on and everything's on the computer. Well, that's problematic. If everything is on the computer, then it's certainly not specially designed instruction. And certainly there's some product, right? That's what teachers do. They teach, and then there's a product that evidences that what they taught had Velcro. And so, you know, I would do it in a way that I want to partner with you. Obviously, if you're doing something great, Mitch, with Billy, I want to reinforce that at home. Our tutor wants to reinforce it at home. His grandmother that does his homework, but I can't reinforce nothing.
Yeah.
Could you provide some examples of SDI for a student who has ADHD and is always moving around, excessively fidgety, and it impacts his focus and ability to learn content?
Well, now one of the things we were talking about before is a number of the really good resources that the Department of Education has. One of them that is really good is the Technical Assistance Center on Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports. You can go to that center and they have quite a bit of information on ADHD, on behavioral issues of also OCD, and so if you're looking for something, that would be a resource I would say you might want to attend to.
Can teachers use district assessments as a way to report IEP progress on goals?
No. Usually district assessments, I mean, they're not meant to measure progress. They're meant to measure relative standing amongst a number of students. What they need to be doing is measuring progress or monitoring progress, and that can be done a number of different ways. One of which is not a district or statewide assessment. That is not an appropriate way to monitor progress. Because what you're essentially doing is you're looking at the individual at different points in time. And what a standardized test like even a statewide test or a district-wide test usually gives you is where the child stands in comparison to his or her peers at different points in time. But that's not the same thing as individual progress.
See,
Again, I would say Intervention Central, Easy CBM. Look at some of those websites and the Progress Center, and pretty much you'll come away with a number of really good, simple, user-friendly ways to measure progress that don't include district or statewide assessments.
you've mentioned several resources while we've been together tonight. Can you provide some additional resources, perhaps specifically for specially designed instruction that individuals can look into?
Well, I would say the best resources on specially designed instruction is probably the Progress Center. They originally, that was what they did. In fact, they did an online webinar um, last year, I believe, and one of the things they talked about was SDI and how you use data how you collect data, what SDI is, and they were talked about a number of the things that we've talked about today. But I would say that's a really good resource on SDI.
I have a school district attorney that insisted a special education teacher in the building meets the legal requirement of close proximity and a watchful eye, so paraprofessionals may deliver specially designed instruction. Is that correct?
No, not really. I mean, even if you look at laws like the Every Student Succeeds Act, it talks about the importance of having a teacher working, and the teacher develops the instruction. Now, like obviously, a paraprofessional or a paraeducator can help with that, but they don't develop the instruction.
I'm a parent mentor for the Autism Society in South Carolina. Some children have dyslexia and autism. Why do schools balk at putting dyslexia in the IEP? And how can we promote the appropriate SDI for children with dyslexia in their IEPs?
Okay, it didn't now I heard South Carolina, but it kind of I didn't hear all of it, but I would say again, the important thing that we attend to is the needs of the child. And you, as a parent, part of the, as you, one of the things you do as part of the IEP is you're involved not only in the IEP development, but you're involved in the assessment, you're involved in the progress monitoring. Um, and I think if you have specific concerns, you need to bring those up at the IEP and make certain they're doing an appropriate assessment that addresses your concerns.
And I'll just add to that. One of the things that I hear is um, this outcome in the class is better described by his ADHD than an SLD. Or, and here's what I would say: the interventions that we have for a child that has autism are not the same interventions at all for a child that has dyslexia. So the two can occur together. And so that's where we get in trouble with, oh, you know, he's got one eligibility, he's in the pool, he gets everything, it's embedded. But how we intervene for a student that has been identified with dyslexia has nothing to do with the characteristics of a student with autism in the DSM-5. So I think that you approach it from that way. So you can have both. And I think that sometimes they think that one disability, and often the one that we found first or identified first, is the driver. And it's important to know that more than two things can exist and be true.
Mm-hmm.
Another one from a school-based member that's with us tonight. Our district's attorney is telling special education teachers to report out progress on unsigned IEPs after the 30-day period if they are still unsigned. The teachers have always reported out on the last signed IEP. I questioned this and people got very mad, and they said to just have teachers do it. The goals have not been worked out yet and agreed upon. Does this make sense?
I don't believe that does, no. I've not come across that particular issue or that kind of advice before, so I don't really know how to respond to that.
So I'll respond to that. I have very good relationships with lots of school-based attorneys. I don't know how long into this journey before I realized I used to think that an attorney only told the truth, and that's silly to think that. There's some really good school district attorneys, and there are attorneys that are not ethical, and it would be unfortunate, but not unusual, because myself and we get hundreds of questions a day from wonderful school-based members that are trying to do what's right, and they're being forced to do things that are just awful. And I can't imagine that kind of work environment. We do hear that, Mitch. We hear that from attorneys. We experience that from attorneys. I know that Stephanie can concur onto that. It's unfortunate. I think the same effort that attorney could use to do that could use the same effort to make things right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How do you decide how many minutes a student should spend on specially designed instruction per week?
Well, how you decide it, that's really in the when you develop the IEP, you determine the hours, and one of the things the idea is very clear on is you have to be very specific. You don't say to be announced. You have to have the frequency, the location, the duration. At the end of the IEP meeting, everyone should know what is being provided to the child, and and it's part of the discussion. If you don't believe the minutes are enough, you have to discuss that as a team.
If I can jump in, one of the ways that I do it, it's just a Karenism, it's not right or wrong. I think two things happen in a classroom: instruction and production. So I would say, if the class is 60 minutes long, and I always ask because things are different at every campus and every location. So I would say if the math block is 60 minutes, I would say, how long does the teacher teach? She would tell me that. And then I would ask for the time that it's independent work, or, that sort of thing. How long is that? For me, I'm not going to ever ask for more than 25% of that block, because we should deliver some specially designed instruction, but he should be able to do some work on his own if we're saying that this setting is appropriate, and then build from there. What I don't like, which we see all the time, is he gets 100 minutes, 100 minutes, 100 minutes, 100, all four core. And, if he doesn't need any help in science, then if he has autism and a speech impairment and he loves science, and he loves math, we don't just need to do the 100, 100, 100. If he doesn't need the support, then don't put it on his paperwork, right? And I don't think that we take enough, this careful consideration as we develop the IEP is for the whole thing. What we want to do in special education is deliver that support, and hopefully when they've learned those strategies, then fade that. But have that conversation. How long is this block? I think parents don't even know in elementary school, reading and ELA is sometimes 2.5 hours long. So when they put down 15 minutes, that's probably not going to be adequate if he has 2 reading disabilities and ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
Alrighty, Dr. Riel, we are all fans. We have someone who said your article, the individualized education program, procedural and substantive requirements, is one of the best articles I've ever read. I know Barry Zirkle talks about the 2-step harmless error approach in safeguarding procedures under IDEA, but could you speak to this form from a hearing officer's standpoint?
Okay, you mean the what Perry calls the harmless error?
Yes.
Okay, well, it's essentially procedures. Earlier on, I was saying if someone says there's a procedural error, I have to determine, well, was it really made? The hearing officer, I should say, determines was that error really made, and 2, did it cause harm? If it's an error, they did make it, but there's no harm, it's a harmless error. And that would mean it's a procedural error, but it doesn't rise to be a denial of FAPE because it didn't harm the child. That's what harmless error essentially means. And by harm, of course, I'm meaning educationally harming the child.
Okay, our next one, not necessarily a question, but I'm a special education teacher, and it is very validating to hear you discuss these things that I've brought up to my administration's attention, and it has resulted in minimal change or action. So thank you for sharing tonight.
And that goes back to earlier on, Karen's, we were going to talk about documentation, and that's very important, especially we've talked about a couple of instances where it seems the child is not receiving, or the school district is not implementing. If you see that as a teacher, document it, put it down. I mean, teachers, you don't have to worry that much. You want to do your job, but the people that really have to worry about things, I think, are the LEA, the school district, from a due process standpoint. They're the ones that need to make certain that IEPs are implemented as written, and they're going to enable a child to make progress.
In my school, we are struggling to get co-teach special education teachers to document SDI strategies, something you were just talking about in the lesson plans. Are there legal requirements for documenting SDI in lessons plans, or is it just in regards to IEP monitoring?
Well, there's really no legal requirement. The legal requirements have to do with implementing the IEP as written. And if there are certain SDI, say a certain amount of minutes or certain accommodations in the IEP that are not being implemented, that is what you document. That's where the problem would occur. And so that's what you want to stress.
Okay. We have one of our partners' clients asking a question. They have a kiddo on an IEP and have needs regarding executive functioning due to ADHD. And the school has already put accommodations in place of breaking up assignments into manageable chunks. But the parent feels there needs to be more specially designed instruction to support him until he graduates. What type of SDI would you consider for this type of need?
Well, I would say that it would be difficult to say what exactly, but I think it would be something that needs to be determined when the school-based members and the parents get together in the IEP team. That's when you make that determination. And like I said, there's a lot of resources out there that you can access, free resources that would help you with that kind of information.
We have someone their son has been receiving speech services for 9 years. He's been working on challenging sounds for 3 years, and each progress report says that he's making sufficient progress to meet the goal. However, he never has met the annual goals. Can you define sufficient progress and best practices on how that's measured?
Well, again, there's really the way you define that is through the annual goals that you write, or in the SLP if it's a related service and you want a certain goal to be met, you'd write a goal for that. And then you make certain they're monitoring the goal. Now, if they're monitoring it and the child is not making progress, if you're monitoring it appropriately, that data has to be reported to the parent. And if you see it's not occurring, that would be a time to, call another IEP meeting. Talk to the LEA representative, the special ed director. If you're really concerned that the IEP is not being implemented, and make certain you document that.
We have a great question for you. And this is one that we know we can point to one of your books. Can you talk about percentages, or I'm sorry, looked at the wrong one. what do you like to see in a good goal, and how would you discuss the framework for a good goal?
What I think is essential in a good goal is that you have a target behavior that's observable and measurable, that you write in your goal how you're going to measure it, and then the last thing, so the third thing would be you have to have a criterion for acceptable performance, or when the goal is mastered and you can move on to another goal or up the goal. So the three things are target behavior, the conditions of measurement, and the criterion for acceptable performance.
Stephanie,
And interestingly enough, if you look at the Progress Center, that's what we put down there on their section and goals.
yeah. So Stephanie, I know we've got a ton more questions. We're gonna just take 2 or 3 more questions because we want to be respectful of Dr. Yale's time, and we'll of course have him on again. But if we can just do a couple more questions, and then we will wrap this up tonight.
In the meantime, while we're getting the questions, I could say there's going to be next week, there will be a special ed case heard at the Supreme Court again.
I saw that. It's Michigan, right? Or Minnesota?
AJT v. Osseo Area Independent School District number 279, my alma mater. I'm from Minnesota, and the Osseo School District I attended from elementary through post.
And what's the components of that?
Well, that is not an idea case. It's really a 504 case.
Yeah.
And it also is an ADA case. And essentially that the courts kind of came up with a standard that to not meet FAPE under 504, the school district has to show, I think they called it bad faith or gross misjudgment. Well, the law doesn't say that. The law does not say that at all. The courts have started to, one court said it and then other courts picked up on it. And I'm thinking the Supreme Court will probably come down on the side of parents that is not the standard of FAPE under 504.
I like those words though.
Yeah, they're good words,
Yes.
but I don't think I think they're almost too, they require too much on the school district in terms of almost animus. That
Right.
I don't think it has to be that serious an error to be a FAPE denial of FAPE under 504.
Absolutely.
Okay, one on the Supreme Court case. Karen, we know you've been in the Supreme Court with me and Travis. They have a question about how can you listen to the case? Is it virtual? Is it just listening to the audio? How do they do that? And then I have one final question for us.
Well, I would say write this down. OYEZ, it's OYEZ.org, I think. That I have been in. I was at the Andrew F. case and heard the oral arguments. I can't make it to AJT case, but probably within 4 hours, the oral arguments will be on that website.
And tell us the website again.
OYEZ and I think it's .org.
Okay.
But I'll email it to you.
Would it also be on SCOTUS?
It'll be on. They'll have a lot of information on SCOTUS blog. It's called.
Yeah.
So if you just put in Google SCOTUS blog, Andrew, or SCOTUS blog AJT, you'll get the URL. But if you want to actually listen to the oral arguments, I don't know. OEA has them, but I don't think SCOTUS blog would have the oral arguments.
Okay. You've never heard anybody ask better questions than the justices. I mean, they are brilliant. And usually the attorneys before them are brilliant as well.
They are, and the poor attorneys prepare for 30 minutes of presentation, and they usually get through about 2 minutes, and they start getting questions from
what about this? What if this happened?
Yeah. So it's pretty interesting process.
Yeah.
Alrighty, well, that was a great tee up for me. What if the school admits that they do not collect data for the IEP goal and states that the student has not made progress? What's next?
I would say probably, you document that. I would say probably just state complaint may be your best way to go. I think clearly that would be an error that any hearing officer would find against the school district, but I don't think parents want to routinely use that. The hearing process is onerous. It's expensive. It doesn't cost you anything to file a complaint.
Yeah.
If they're just saying, sorry, we didn't meet the goal, we didn't measure it, but that's just too bad. I mean, you need to go beyond uh, and file a complaint with an issue like that.
Yeah, and we have tons on YouTube and our platforms, but we have a digital product on how to file a state complaint that really goes through all the components. And I always say it's just the facts, ma'am. I think the biggest error that I see parents make in a state complaint is they tell them what they felt like and how they were treated instead of, we always, as Mitch said, what is the question before the court, right? The question before the court is not, did Stephanie not let me have my meeting on Tuesday at 1? There's a lot of things that are wrong, but they're not illegal, right? So we're looking at those probably 4 or 5 things that we ever file on. And then what can you support, in your filing, not just, I think it happened. And I think it's so important that if you're a parent by yourself, that you go in fully prepared with your questions, sort of like going to the doctor or the grocery store. It could be the one thing that you went in there for and you forget. And these are all well-meaning people at the table, but this is your child's future. And what happens in these 18 years will drive what happens in the next 80 years. And, I go fully prepared into the meeting with my questions. I have 3 things on deck, which is why I like Zoom platforms. I have last year's full IEP. I have the full draft for today, knowing that it's just a draft and all decisions are made in the meeting. And then I have his evaluation, the last big one, in case I need to pull from that. And most parents walk in or log on. They don't have a pen, they don't have a piece of paper, and they're just being talked to through documents. And it's okay if you have questions. It's okay if we don't finish the meeting. It's okay if we have to table it. It is your child's future. And so know that you are equal co team members, and you should have questions. It's your child. And that's the way that we better partner with schools, so that we both the school and the parent can equally have an opportunity to implement and work on delivering the IEP and making gains. And so, certainly use your procedural rights and safeguards. They're in place for the child and the parent. I always say that you don't have rights if you don't, one, know about them, and then if you don't, exercise them, right? And so, what I find in state complaints, even if it's found, which I love this name, harmless error, that should have been the name of my first husband, but is even when I've filed and on, allegation 1 or allegation 2, the school said he made progress, so we do not substantiate allegation 1. It does change the way this child is treated going forward. And, we don't file to got you or to do that, but it's important that you exercise your rights. That's what they're for, because you won't get a do-over. Your child's not getting time back. And often these state complaints bring about training for schools that they just didn't have, right? It's part of the corrective action plan from the state. So certainly do that. So Dr. Yale, Mitch, just love you. Would love to have you on a million times. Thank you for coming on. And when is your new edition coming out, or do you control that, or the public?
Well, I finished the next edition, the 6th edition. It should be out, I would say probably. Well, they will have it out before fall semester.
We should make you make an audio book. How many hours would that be? We would love an audio book. So thank you. You guys will get this recording, and then of course we're going to upload it to YouTube. We'll get as many as those links attached to it. Thank you so much, Mitch, for coming on, and we are excited to have you on again in the future. So thanks, you guys. Remember, we get it right for the child, we get it right for everybody, and we'll see y'all at the next training.
Bye-bye.
Hit subscribe, share this with a friend, and you know what? Meet me back here every single week. We're not just talking about change, we're making it. Because when you know better, you do better. And when we get it right for the child, we get it right for everybody.